Maybe let's kick off there then, and then we will let in anybody else who arrives. So thank you again so much for joining us today, everyone. My name is Derek Thorne. I'm the head of the Media Freedom Coalition Secretariat, and we're hosted by the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And welcome to this joint event organised by the Media Freedom Coalition and the Freedom Online Coalition, which is called Preventing Internet Shutdowns to Protect Press Freedom and Digital Rights. I'd like to thank everyone for your flexibility in being able to join this call online. Obviously, it was planned to be taking place in Osaka today, but we're really grateful that everyone was able to shift their availability and to join us here on the call. This call is being recorded, and then we will make the event available on the MFC's website. So that means that if there's any sections that you would like to highlight to colleagues of yours, you will be able to refer them to the recording of the call. This session will involve a panel discussion shortly, and then there will be a Q&A section, so you will be able to ask questions from the audience. When that point comes, you'll be able to raise your hand, and then my colleague will unmute you. But we'll get to that point later on after the main panel discussion. But firstly, I would like to welcome some eminent speakers to provide some opening remarks to the session. So firstly, I would like to welcome Ambassador Katja Perhmann, who is the Ambassador for Human Rights and Disability Inclusion from Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as all of you, I'm sure will know, Finland, alongside the UK, is the co-chair currently of the Media Freedom Coalition. So Ambassador Perhmann, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Derek. Thank you for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here virtually. Thank you so much for the invitation. If I may, I do have to say that it's very unfortunate that we cannot meet in person in Lusaka as was planned. I believe there is a wealth of frustration and disappointment in this regard, as many participants were looking forward to important meetings and encounters at a time when civic space is increasingly shrinking. Therefore, I'm glad that this crucial discussion was not cancelled but moved online. Again, it's a great pleasure to provide opening remarks for such a vital discussion co-organized two important coalitions, namely the Media Freedom Coalition and Freedom Online Coalition. Finland was privileged to chair the Freedom Online Coalition 5 years ago. By then, it was evident that authoritarian regimes were utilizing digitalization as a means to repression, which I believe has become increasingly common. In the FOC, we have advocated for open, safe, and global internet and digital inclusion to strengthen democracy and human rights. Since July last year, we have co-chaired the Media Freedom Coalition, and in this role, our priorities include protection of journalists with special emphasis on female journalists, as well as promotion of media literacy. The discussion today exemplifies the synergy among coalitions with closely aligned and intersecting agendas. Internet shutdowns are measures taken by a government or on behalf of a government to intentionally disrupt access to and the use of information and communication systems online. When people are disconnected, it impacts all of life: education, work, medical care, and all kinds of daily activities. Internet shutdowns cause significant harm to human rights, including the right to freedom of expression, the right of access to information, and the right to peaceful assembly. They contravene human rights law if they fail to meet the strict criteria for restricting rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They must be necessary, proportionate, based on a valid legal basis, and be consistent with the principle of non-discrimination. Dear members of the audience, dear colleagues, internet shutdowns often used by governments to control narratives during unrest or elections directly threaten media freedom. Journalists cannot have access to sources and essential information. They are unable to communicate with newsrooms and publish news stories. Moreover, such deliberate measures, from social media access to imposing full communication blackouts, can weaken watchdog functions of the media and impede the recording of human rights abuses. Internet shutdowns and disruptions not only affect the ability of journalists and media workers to provide verified information and news, but also deprive the public from essential information. When internet is down and media cannot operate, who and what will gain ground? The void is often filled by unverified rumors and, depending on the context, from state-controlled disinformation and propaganda. Media has a particularly critical role in promoting and protecting human rights in conflict situations when people's lives, health, and safety depend on objective, accurate, and timely information. Internet shutdowns during conflict and crisis can stop people from accessing life-saving information and humanitarian aid. I'm confident that we will have a very interesting discussion today. So thank you very much again, and back to you, Derek.
Thank you very much. And so now I would like to hand over for some further opening remarks from Sylvie Coudray, the Director for Freedom of Expression, Media Development and Media and Information Literacy from UNESCO. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be among you, even though it's in Paris and on online, but I think it's a very important meeting. So thank you to Excellency, and thank you to the Media Freedom Coalition and the Freedom Online Coalition for co-organizing this event. I'm warmly congratulating also UK, as it assumes the role of co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, and I thank Germany for its strong and principled leadership. My appreciation also goes to the Media Freedom Coalition Secretariat for coordinating this timely and necessary gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be very direct. Our information space is under pressure. We are living through a moment in which connectivity itself has become a frontline issue for freedom of expression. We are living through a global polycrisis, conflicts, climate shocks, political instability, and cyber attacks. In this environment, journalists are at the front line. UNESCO data is clear. 67% of journalists killed in the past 4 years were killed in crisis context. They are not isolated tragedies, they are part of a pattern. And today the threat journalists face go beyond bullets. They include digital repression, internet shutdowns, platform thwarting, deliberate disruptions of connectivity. Internet shutdown do not only affect users in the abstract, they directly endanger journalists. When connectivity is severed, journalists lose access to their sources, to their audiences, and to the digital tools that help keep them safe. They are preventing from verifying information, documenting violations, or transmitting evidence. When the internet goes dark, so does accountability. Internet shutdowns create an information vacuum, and disinformation fills it fast. They also endanger lives, no verified information, no emergency communication, no documentation, no evidence. In a crisis, an internet shutdown can be as dangerous as a physical attack. It isolates reporters, disrupts emergency response, and increases the likelihood that violence goes unreported and unpunished. Yet, despite this reality, the world is not ready. A forthcoming UNESCO study shows that 59% of regulatory experts report that crisis-related data systems are not integrated into national preparedness frameworks. Crisis communication protocols for citizens are rarely in place. At the same time, digital infrastructure is increasingly targeted. Submarine cables, satellites, cloud systems. They are not simply technical disruptions. They are media freedom disruptions. They determine whether journalists can publish, whether citizens can access to reliable information, and ultimately whether truth can survive in times of crisis. The broader trends make this even more alarming. We just published a world trend report in freedom of expression and media development, and freedom of expression has declined globally by 10% since 2012, driven by rising attacks on journalists and expanding restrictions on digital rights. At the same time, nearly 1/3 of the world's population still lacks access to internet in 2024, deepening inequalities in access to information, participation, and opportunities. Internet shutdowns sit at the intersection of these trends. UNESCO has repeatedly raised concerns about the growing use of internet shutdowns by governments to manage political crises, including in a public statement that we have issued in January 26. Over the past 2 years alone, more than 300 internet shutdowns have been recorded across more than 50 countries. These measures are often justified as temporary or exceptional, but their impact is wide and lasting. They disrupt hospitals and emergency services. They undermine elections and democratic participation. They cut off small businesses for customers, and they silence entire communities. And they disproportionately affect women and young people. Women journalists already face higher levels of online harassment and abuse. When connectivity is cut, their voices are silenced even further. Young people depend on digital access for learning, information, and civic participation. When the network goes down, their future opportunities are also constrained. So the question before us is clear. What must we do? First, we must see the full picture. Protecting journalists today requires more than physical safety measures. It requires ensuring that the digital ecosystem they depend on is resilient, transparent, and governed by a human rights-based approach. This is why UNESCO work on journalist safety, information integrity, and digital platform governance must be understood as deeply interconnected. We cannot meaningfully protect journalists if we allow the digital system they rely on to remain fragile, opaque, or vulnerable to abuse. Second, we must act together. In a world of rising censorship, disinformation, and geopolitical tension, no single actor can protect media freedom alone. This is precisely why Media Freedom Coalition and Freedom Online Coalition are so critically important. By bringing together more than 50 countries and operating across diplomacy, advocacy, legal reform, and funding, the coalitions demonstrate that protecting free expression requires not only shared principles, but sustained international cooperation and collective action. Third, we must deliver concrete results. Through UNESCO Global Media Defense Funds, we have supported over 10,000 journalists worldwide and backed strategic litigation to challenge unlawful internet shutdowns. In one landmark case, court action restored connectivity for more than 24 million people, protecting journalists' ability to report and the public rights to know. UNESCO also advanced standard setting and advocacy through its leadership on universal access to information. At the 2023 International Day for Universal Access to Information, stakeholders adopted the Oxford Statement, which explicitly warned against internet shutdowns that undermine elections, media freedom, and public participation. At the same time, we do invest in crisis-ready digital governance. As you may know, we have worked a lot on governance of digital platforms, including through a global forum of regulatory networks and a think tank of academic freedom. We are also ready to launch a new study on digital regulation in times of crisis, which identified serious gaps. Crisis communication is not prioritized. Attacks on digital infrastructure are increasing, and regulatory frameworks lag behind ecosystem level risk, and guidance for citizens is largely absent. Despite growing recognition of the importance of digital systems, international humanitarian law has not yet fully adapted to protect them. And finally, UNESCO continues to strengthen judicial protection for freedom of expression. Ladies and gentlemen, free media cannot exist without free and open networks. If we want truth to endure through crisis, we must protect both journalists and the digital lifelines they rely on. The path forward is clear. We must build information systems that remain open in terms of crisis. We must protect those who report and the network that carry their work. We must ensure that facts travel faster than fear. Connectivity is no longer optional for journalism. It is essential infrastructure for democracy. Protecting it is not a technical choice, it's a human rights obligation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we can now move into the panel discussion. We've got a very exciting set of speakers, and I'm going to begin by handing over to our moderator, who is Catherine Gicheru, the director of the Africa Women Journalism Project, and I should also say a very experienced journalist in her own right. Catherine, I'll hand over to you, and you're welcome to take it forward.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to Katja and Sylvie. You've done a good job of framing the issue that we're going to be looking at. And good afternoon, everybody. We're meeting at a time when internet shutdowns are no longer exceptional. It used to be that sometimes you'd hear not so many countries were doing this, but now it's as common as hearing. I mean, the issue of internet shutdowns happen almost every other day. And it's not only happening when there are elections or protests or political crisis. Most of the time, they're justified, or the governments that do this justify them in the name of security or public order. In some countries in my neighborhood, they've shut the internet down because they're doing exams, national exams. So the reasons have moved from the whole gamut from security to basic things like we don't want our children to cheat during the exams, and then they shut down everybody. But one of the things that when connectivity is shut, journalists lose not only access to their sources and their audiences, but citizens are also cut off from receiving critical information, like Katja mentioned. And the space for independent reporting, debate, and accountability shrinks, often at the very moment when citizens need to be able to access information. We also know that the impacts are not evenly felt. Smaller, local, independent media are often hit hardest, and shutdowns often create the kind of information vacuums that lead to misinformation, disinformation, all manner of malinformation. And that leads to a loss in public trust, which then feeds into the whole issue of creating tensions, as well as allowing misinformation to thrive. When I was asked to moderate this conversation, I told myself it's coming at the right time, because for me, I look at it as having a discussion about three basic things. First, understanding how and why shutdowns are happening. Secondly, what they mean in practice for journalists, for citizens, and for democratic space. And thirdly, and most importantly, what can actually be done? What can we actually do to prevent them? And how can we respond when they do happen? We'll be looking at these issues from different angles. We have in the panel people who can talk about policy, about the law, about the industry, and the lived experiences that we need. And I know many of you in the audience also can have experiences or can contribute to this. And we want to make sure that there will be room for you to ask your questions. We have a fantastic panel, as I mentioned, and I'll just do a quick introduction. We have Anite Hickok, who is the manager, and I'm hoping, I beg your pardon and I apologize ahead of time in case I mispronounce your names. I want to apologize ahead of time. Anite is the managing director at the Global Network Initiative. Then I have my little sister, Nompilo Simanje, who is the Africa Program Lead at the International Press Institute. My namesake from Uganda, though, Catherine Anite, who is a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. And then we have Stefan Kossoff, who is the head of democratic governance at the UK Foreign Office. I just want to start with you, Eleni, so that maybe you can help us set the scene. A quick one, just looking at the past year or so, what are some of the main patterns you have seen on how governments are using internet shutdowns, and what is driving these decisions? Eleni?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. And maybe just a quick step back to talk a little bit about GNI. So the Global Network Initiative where I work, we are a multi-stakeholder initiative, and we bring together companies, civil society, academics, and investors towards building responsible conduct in the tech sector. And in doing so, particularly in the context of overly broad government mandates, and that includes network shutdowns that we see coming from governments. And just to talk about the way that we have approached trying to address network shutdowns, we have a layered approach. So one, we track and call out practices so that we see governments doing. We speak in our collective voice. So we have over 100 members, and we put out statements condemning shutdowns in Iran, condemning shutdowns in Uganda, etc. So we are calling out practices that we see. We track legislation. So where we see where there is a regulatory authority given to governments to conduct network shutdowns, we call that out. We are also tracking that. So we have something called the Country Legal Resource Framework, which is a comprehensive framework looking at dozens of different countries and mapping out their regulatory ecosystem to understand what are the legal authorities at which governments are taking these actions. And then we also develop best practices for governments and companies for ways in which that they can push back against government shutdowns, alternatives to implementing shutdowns. And then lastly, our company members undertake an assessment process to understand how are they responding to government shutdowns, including, how are they responding to government mandates, including requests for shutdowns? And maybe I'll get into a little bit later just the kinds of questions that we're asking our company members about how they are responding to these types of requests. But maybe just to help set the scene and lay the base for the conversation, when you ask the question about what are the techniques that we're seeing when it comes to internet shutdown, I wanted to try to pull these into 5 different buckets of ways internet shutdowns can happen. So you can see shutdowns happening at the fundamental infrastructure layer. So this might be through mobile network disconnection, shutting down 3G, 4G, 5G, etc. You can see physical cable sabotage. You can see power grid cuts. So that's at the kind of fundamental infrastructure layer. Then you can see routing disruptions. So repressive governments can manipulate the border gateway protocol, the BGP, essentially the post office of the internet, routing at international gateways, such as withdrawal of routing data, blackholing. You can see DNS manipulation. This method acts like manipulating an address book, directing users away from intended websites, often used to block specific services like DNS filtering or poisoning, blocking DNS traffic. We can see packet filtering or deep packet inspection, IP blocking, deep packet inspection, platform-specific blocking, and then we also see throttling, so speed reduction of different speeds on the internet or targeted throttling. Now, another point that I wanted to make just very quickly is that different types of companies are impacted differently by and can be targeted differently by government mandates or requests for internet shutdowns. And again, I'll try to bring this into 5 different buckets. So we see companies.
Eleni, so that we can give everybody else a chance, and also so that we can actually have a conversation. I just wanted to get back to you in terms of out of all the ones you've mentioned, which one have you seen most common over the last 2 years, 1.5 years, 2 years? What are some of those ways of throttling or shutting down the internet? What has been most common? What have you seen in the last 2 years or so?
So I think there's really, I guess the point I was trying to say is that there's a mix of it. And it's important to, like, when we look at network shutdowns, I guess the main point is to say that there are different types of ways that the shutdown can happen. And it can happen to different types of companies, from ISPs to CDNs, content delivery networks, to social media apps, etc. So just to say that it's not just a network shutdown, there are a lot of different layers to it. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, let me turn to Nompile. I mean, just think about, you mentioned when we were talking earlier, you were handling an internet shutdown scenario. Just think of one where you've worked on and what stopped working fast for journalists, and how did that affect their ability to report on in the first 24 hours? I mean, I'm just trying to get you to paint a picture of what actually happens when this happens, and how that impacts on journalists especially.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yeah, I mean, and a big thanks also to Sylvie and to Katja for laying the table quite nicely in terms of highlighting the impact of internet shutdowns on the press. I think I'd highlight two scenarios here. One being the most recent one with the Ugandan election. That you'd find that initially there were concerns that the government was going to shut down the internet, but the government responded and said it had no intention of shutting down the internet. But along the way, just a day before the election, the government did put out a statement that it was going to shut down the internet. So already, with regard to the press, they sort of were lucky to get a bit of a heads up in terms of what was going to happen. So in that moment, the press knew that internet was going to be shut down. They were not going to be able to communicate, particularly reporting on the election that was going to happen. But then in another scenario, I'll give the scenario of my home country, Zimbabwe. That was in 2019, and there were protests happening at the time. Initially, it was a partial internet shutdown. So certain platforms were blocked, and people could not access certain messaging platforms, right? But they still were able to communicate. They were able to use other alternative means. For example, Signal, where WhatsApp and Facebook were blocked, people started using Telegram. People started downloading VPNs, for example, to circumvent that partial internet shutdown. But then eventually it turned into a more broader, complete, total internet shutdown where they could not communicate, where everyone could not communicate at all. But before that happened, also, I recall that some of the internet service providers actually did issue notices to say we have received a directive from the government, particularly the Ministry of State Security, ordering us to shut down the internet. So this is where also the GNI and its work with companies comes into play. And I'm highlighting these two scenarios just to say you'd find that the way internet shutdowns happen, they vary across the different countries. But what is important in all of this is for journalists to be prepared. We already know the kind of scenarios where internet shutdowns are most likely to happen. And I think it is always important for the media sector, for the media community, to be more proactive in terms of ensuring that should the internet shutdown or any other restriction happen, they have the necessary tools to allow them to communicate, or at least to continue documenting amidst the internet shutdown. So the scenarios have varied, but also, which also means the impact is also varied. But broadly, what has already been highlighted is what transpires, being that internet shutdowns create a vacuum. They limit or entirely restrict the capacity of the media to report, to engage with their sources, but also the public's right to information. And more importantly, also public security, because in instances of internet shutdowns, people are also not able to receive the necessary physical security and support that they need amidst all the human rights violations and attacks that happen when people are in a blackout and they do not have the capacity to communicate.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, Catherine, I want to pull you in and maybe you talk from the legal perspective. What are the immediate legal consequences, especially when journalists or when the internet shutdowns happen? What are the most immediate things that we need to be aware, or what you've seen, especially in the Ugandan scenario, when they did a partial and then it was 100, when they said they wouldn't and then they did. What are the immediate legal consequences for journalists and other media practitioners?
Thank you, Catherine, and for the previous speakers for setting the clear grounds for the conversation. And I was going to tell Nompilo, Uganda is one of the most democratic countries. That's a joke amongst many of us here. I want to start from the premise that freedom of expression is not absolute. It's not an absolute right. So that means that many governments actually can interfere with this right and restrict it, and that includes internet shutdowns. But as we have heard from the previous speakers, there are very dire consequences to internet shutdowns. When we look at the legal bit of it, we know that any restriction should be found in the law. And as Nompilo rightly mentioned, many times when you look at internet shutdowns across many countries, the internet service providers will say, we got a phone call from the government or from the minister saying, shut down the internet. There's normally no law quoted. It's just speculation that there's going to be some sort of chaos. So when we look at the legal parameters, we have to acknowledge that governments may have or may be having the right to restrict freedom of expression and access to information, but the restriction should be found in law. It must serve a legitimate purpose, and it should be necessary in a democratic society. We also need to look at the proportionality of these restrictions. For example, if students are going to do an exam, should you restrict internet for everyone? Those are questions that we need to analyze. So for journalists and the wider society, we've seen that internet restrictions or internet shutdowns have had a dire effect, violating their right to freedom of expression, access to information. But it's also crucial to note that internet shutdowns may also infringe on other rights, like the right to health. Sometimes we see hospitals, having to provide access to medical attention through online platforms. But many times when the internet is shut down, a lot of people actually do suffer from the shutdown.
Yeah.
The question, I think the key question here we need to ask is, how can there be a fair balance between, the right to freedom of expression and access to information, and how can legislation be drafted to enable this balance?
Okay, great. I want to bring in Stefan here. Take this beyond just the media. What are some of the most immediate costs that society or countries suffer when their internet shutdowns? I know I want us to go beyond just the media, because I know we are talking about the media, but like Catherine said, and like all the other speakers have alluded to, there are other issues beyond just media which is impacted. Stefan?
Indeed, and thanks for bringing me in, Catherine. I just want to say thanks for this fantastic panel as well. We faced a different kind of shutdown in Lusaka this week, so it's good that we've been able to overcome it, and it's actually a good example of how we can use digital tools to overcome some of the constraints that governments put on us. Maybe it's subject for another panel. I think that the first thing I just want to say is this is a really urgent issue. It's in fact an existential issue as Sylvie was implying at the start, for democracy in the world. And I note that there were a shocking 313 shutdowns in 52 countries in 2025. And this form of government control of digital access is clearly on an upward trajectory. So this is a really timely and important and urgent conversation we're having here now. In terms of the impact, I think a lot of people have covered the impacts on journalists in particular, as you say. In terms of citizens more broadly, I mean, obviously, shutdowns affect the ability of citizens to access services. They disrupt their economic activity. They limit people's ability to communicate and organize, and particularly to participate in democratic processes. As we know, often shutdowns happen around elections. And in crisis situations, they can leave communities without the information that they need to stay safe, to make informed decisions. As Sylvie says, with particularly bad impacts for women, for young people, for marginalized groups. And shutdowns carry substantial costs for broader public safety and security, especially in your conflict context, which Katja was talking to at the outset. When connectivity is cut, emergency information can't be circulated, crisis response systems are disrupted. As I said, communities lose their access to how they stay safe. And obviously there's a wider economic impact, right? Shutdowns interrupt business operations, they interrupt financial services and trade. They have disproportionate effects on SMEs and informal workers in particular, who depend on mobile connectivity. And they undermine wider investor confidence. They can disrupt supply chains. In short, they can actually inflict lasting damage on economic resilience, which you would hope is important for the governments which are sometimes imposing these measures on their society. So whole range of impacts. I mean, just very briefly, I saw that there was a question on the Media Freedom Coalition in the sidebar, and just to say, as others have, coalitions like MFC and Freedom Online Coalition are clearly essential tools in our armory in terms of how to respond. They enable governments to act collectively, set international expectations, and apply coordinated diplomatic pressure when that occurs. And that was seen in the example of FOC's response to the recent disruptions in Iran, also the collective messaging that the MFC has done to protect access to information during crises. So both of these vehicles are really important. They act in tandem often to amplify our voice, to reinforce shared norms, and help protect journalists and citizens in the places where shutdowns happen.
I had not unmuted. I want to come back to Elena. I know you've had your hand up for the longest time, but the question I wanted to ask you, Elena, is basically like, is there any one moment when an internet shutdown is going down, or whatever kind of interruption of the network interruption is happening, where the action can be stopped? Is there at any one time all these different things, the DNSs, all the stuff, all the different examples that you gave earlier of how the internet is stopped? Is there any one particular time in all those different processes where it can be stopped or reversed? Is there any way we can intervene to stop it from going ahead?
Okay, so I was actually going to just add a little bit more to the legal component that the other panelists were talking about. So in some of the work that we've done in terms of tracking the different regulations and regulatory environments around network shutdowns, one thing that we're seeing is that these powers are coming in license agreements, right? And that's important because it is hard for telcos and ISPs to push back to stop the shutdown because it has to do with them actually being able to operate in a country. And that also means that on the ground staff are often at risk when they're trying to navigate and respond to network shutdowns. And I think that's a really important component of the discussion when we're thinking about the response, because it is absolutely the journalists, it's the individuals, it is the citizen that is impacted, it is also the staff of the company that is impacted by the shutdowns and the regime that they are operating in. We also are seeing these powers in legislation like criminal codes, like communication laws. It can come from an executive branch. It can also come from the judiciary. So we're seeing different bodies issue these orders. We talked a lot about the different grounds like national security, public order. I think a concerning trend that we've been tracking, which makes it hard to push back against shutdowns, is heavy-handed penalties for non-compliance. This can be jail time, etc. That company staff can be held accountable for. And then another trend that we see is just restrictions around the transparency of orders. And so often during network shutdowns, you don't know exactly what the order was. There's not a lot of transparency about what's happening, etc. You don't know the reason for that network shutdown. And in part, that is because there are often restrictions on companies for putting in place and sharing more information about the orders. And I guess, in terms of your question, the way I would answer it is that from GNI's perspective, what we encourage companies to do is to do just different levels of human rights due diligence and human rights impact assessments when they are thinking about entering into new countries, into new markets, new services, to understand at the very outset what is the risk for these kinds of requirements or these kinds of requests that they might be getting, what is the regulatory environment that they are operating in. Then we also ask them to have in place policies and processes for escalation so they can have a rapid response. And then we ask them to have specific things that they do when they get orders, right? So if it is an actual legal order, do they commit to only complying with legal orders? Do they commit to complying in the most narrow way possible? Again, can you stop it? Maybe there is a more narrow way to comply with the order itself. Can they disclose information? What can they disclose? How rapidly can they share that, etc.? So I would say there are just a series of different steps, starting from policies and processes companies need to have in place to how do they respond when they actually get, if it's informal, the phone call from a government official or an actual written request from the government.
Thank you. I want to turn to Catherine, a quick one. Do you know of any country or any law or any, I guess, what Elona has talked about? We have all these laws, whether it's coming from the judiciary or enacted through our parliament or whatever it is. Do you know of any country that has any kind of legal framework, if you want to call it, that can be used as a best case, if you want to call it, when it comes to stopping internet shutdowns or pushing back on internet shutdowns?
I'm not,
and then we can go to
yeah. So I'm not really aware of a country that has a comprehensive framework on internet shutdowns. I know there are regional bodies like the African Commission that have prescribed in their principles of freedom of expression, limits to internet shutdowns and how they should happen. But in terms of specific legislation, most countries do use their communication acts to embed certain vague or ambiguous provisions to shut down the internet. And when you critically look, most of the countries are, extracting very unrelated provisions within those laws to shut down internet. And many times, you know, they relate it to public order or national security. So it's all over the place. So I think later on we shall discuss, you know, what a comprehensive law should look like, and yeah, I'm happy to give some pointers to that.
Okay. Nompilo, you had a point to make on the issue? Then we can go to I wanted to take on Stefan on something on policy, but go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine G. I'd meant to jump in earlier when Catherine Anite was speaking, especially around the legal side of things, and to reaffirm what she has already mentioned now around the legal vacuum, that when you look at the legislation that we have, whether it's telecommunications laws, whether it's interception of communications laws or any other provisions that states are relying on, you'd find that there is no specific provision which explicitly authorizes an internet shutdown, but also no policy framework that explicitly highlights that the legality or illegality of internet shutdowns. And when you look at the example of Zimbabwe that I gave, I remember at the time I was working with the Media Institute of Southern Africa, and we instituted strategic litigation after the total internet shutdown was enforced. And when the court gave its order, the conversation was not on the merits. It was not on the legality of the internet shutdown itself, but rather on the person who had given the directive. So the court ordered the government to restore the internet, to restore internet access on the basis that the minister who gave the directive did not have the authority to do so. So the judiciary did not speak to the core of the issue, being whether internet shutdowns are legal in the first place, and if they are, to what extent they can be imposed or what safeguards should be put in place. So that's also the other legal vacuum that exists, which makes it difficult, particularly for the media and for civil society, to coordinate themselves when internet shutdowns are imminent.
You mentioned policy. I want to ask Stefan, what is the one, or if you had to highlight one policy safeguard that you think governments should put in place to prevent internet shutdowns? What is maybe one thing you'd want to highlight? And then I'll go down the table to everybody else after
Thanks,
that.
Catherine.
I want to hear your own insights, because
I hate to be terribly unoriginal, but it draws really on what Nompilo and Catherine were saying before. I mean, the key safeguard is to ensure that any interference with digital connectivity is governed by a clear legal framework that's lawful, necessary, and proportionate, and subject to independent oversight. I think that's a really, really critical element. And actually, I wouldn't say that we've got everything right in the UK. I'm sure we can learn from others, and this is actually a really dynamic area of law by definition. But we do apply these principles through a well-established legal framework. So any action that could affect communications networks in the UK must comply with certain clearly delineated statutory safeguards and our own independent oversight mechanism. So basically it means that the government of the day cannot impose any constraints on digital operations without a robust legal justification. And that has to be the core number one safeguard that we're working towards.
Okay, I'll go to beyond. Is the only way to stop internet shutdowns dependent on the legal framework? Are there other ways we could, or you could share that, I'm talking to the panelists, that we can take into account or consider, so that we are not just thinking, okay, we need to change the law, we need to change the law. That's just one. Are there other ways we can try and use to prevent internet shutdown? I'm looking at you, Nompilo, and Catherine, as well as Elonai. Are there other ways? What is the one thing maybe you can mention which you can use to try and prevent the internet shutdowns, other than just the law, like Stefan has mentioned?
I'm happy to jump in, Catherine. Well, I mean, I think for me, the key aspect is around recognition or acknowledgement. When we started this conversation, we're talking about how blocking internet access hampers so many fundamental rights. We started off from media freedom, access to information, free expression, freedom of assembly and association. And Catherine brought it even further to access to health, access to education. Stefan also built on that to highlight even economic impacts. And I think at this point and in this digital era, I think the good starting point would be political will, and deliberate acknowledgement or commitment from governments, which recognizes that internet access is not just a tool anymore, but it's an enabler of fundamental rights. So if countries are truly interested in upholding their constitution, the rights that they've highlighted in their constitutions, then they also need to acknowledge the importance of internet access. If the government values internet access as a tool for the realization of their Bill of Rights, then it will not even think about shutting down the internet in the first place. Because at the end of the day, it's all about government sitting down and thinking, how do we regulate a potential scenario of violence? How do we regulate? How do we control information? But if they recognize the value of the internet access as an enabler for fundamental rights that they seek to protect, then they would not even suggest shutting down the internet in the first place. That would be one of the key ideas that I have right now. But of course, I mean, there are several ways to do it even beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, Elonai?
Yeah, sure. Just to add on what Nompilo has said, I have had extensive conversations with members of parliament across Africa and judicial officers, including Supreme Court judges, on the issue of internet shutdowns. On the first day, the whole room is for internet shutdowns, especially members of parliament. So there's a huge capacity gap and understanding on the importance of freedom of expression, access to information. There's a training that I had for members of parliament, and I thought more than a half of the room was in for internet shutdowns. After the 3 days, they did understand the dire effects of internet shutdowns, and many of them went back to their countries with this whole idea of reforming laws and even speaking against internet shutdown. So I feel like there's a real huge capacity gap. And when we involve the policymakers in these conversations, the judicial officers in these conversations, then we'll have better outcomes in terms of, when there's an internet shutdown and you go to court, the judicial officer will understand the international and regional parameters on which to decide the case. Like Nompilo said, they normally avoid the legal issues. And when you read many of the cases are one on the issue of mootness. The judges normally say, now that internet has been restored, the case is moot. So no one is willing to go into the legality of the issues to provide a precedent on internet shutdowns in many of these countries. So I think besides the laws, we have a lot of work to do to engage these policymakers so they can understand the dire consequences of these internet shutdowns.
Okay, thank you. Elena, can I put you in, and from you, maybe you can let us know, are there ways or technologies that we can use? I mean, we know VPNs and all the rest of it. Is there a way of maybe using technologies that we can, or I want to use technologies, it sounds very important, but is there any way we can use technology to avoid or to prevent internet shutdown? Are there tools other than just the usual VPNs that we can use to prevent internet shutdowns? I just want you to pull you in and maybe give us a highlight, maybe one thing. Working with GNI, you may have something that we can take away from the discussion that can help.
Yeah, I mean, so there are definitely circumvention tools, and there are things like VPNs. There are also techniques being explored, like C2D. But I just to build on what some other people have said in terms of how to respond to and push back against internet shutdowns, I would say agree with yes, importance to widen the human rights lens through which disruptions are examined, so we understand the different rights that are being impacted. Yes, enhancing efforts to document, share information, and raise awareness of the impacts of network disruptions. Yes, on awareness of the impact within the government on network shutdowns, but also just alternatives. So, like, if the government wants to address cheating on exams, or if the government wants to address public unrest, what are other solutions? What are other means to achieve that? And I think there is a really big question that we need to be asking about how effective shutdowns really are to, say, achieving what they are being justified for. And I think, that is an evidence-based, and I'm not sure how strong it is actually in terms of how effective shutdowns are for achieving some of the means that they're being justified for. And I would just say that another thing to think about is just the way in which the market is structured, right? So if it's a state-owned telecom, centralized, fewer providers, it is more vulnerable to large-scale disconnection versus a market that has the diversity of service providers, foreign, national, et cetera. So that is something to keep in mind. And I think it's also, when you think about capacity building within the government, it's not just the ICT, and it's just not the judiciary that needs to be, that we need capacity built around, but just a range of different types of ministries, because often they are turning, like education, health, et cetera, because they can turn to internet shutdowns when trying to solve a problem within their own domain and their own ministry. And I would just say that there's really a range of civil society organizations doing a lot of different kinds of work, a lot of different theory of changes to try to address internet shutdowns, from Access Now, who has been tracking it for a very long time, best practices, speaking out against it, to Ranking Digital Rights, who is tracking company disclosures around network shutdowns. What are they putting out in their sustainability reports? What are they saying in their terms and conditions? To GNI, where we are looking at the actual policies and processes that companies have. And so, if there are people in the audience who are like, okay, what are the tools that I can turn to? There's really quite a bit out there. And I would say that there's also organizations that are starting to collect more data, like Uni, as well as companies like Cloudflare that are making data about disruptions more available, that can be a useful resource.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Stefan. I know your hand is tired, but I saw you, but I wanted Anite to kind of share that information with us. From you, Stefan, I wanted to know, what role do you see governments playing, whether through embassies or through HQs like your ministry, when an internet shutdown happens? What role should governments play in that scenario? And what does it look like in practice?
Okay.
And I know we get statements saying condemning. I'm sorry, I'm not putting down that it's not important, but what do you see as the role of governments when it comes to internet shutdown? What should we do?
Thanks, Catherine. I just wanted to sort of finish on the last question as well, because obviously the legal framework matters. That's the international legal framework and the domestic one for setting the right kinds of norms and policy frameworks that can sort of bind governments from one sort of administration to the next. Eleanor has spoken to some of the technological workarounds, which I think are really important as well. But the one thing I wanted to say is, ultimately, this isn't a technical problem. This is a political problem. So as with all other areas of development policy, we have to think and work politically. And that means understanding the landscape of power in which we operate in, and understanding the interests and the incentives of the governments that are imposing shutdowns, and also the wider society. And it's by doing that that you can identify where the levers might be, both at the international level and domestically. And I totally agree with what was being said. I think, there may be parts of government that we can identify as champions for this agenda, who see the impact, for example, on service delivery. There may be parts of the business sector in particular that we work with, given what I said before about the impacts of shutdowns on business efficacy. So we really, when we're thinking about this problem of internet shutdowns, the legal measures are important. The technological innovations will help us, but ultimately it's a political problem, and we need to think politically. In terms of what governments can do, we obviously have an important role to play in raising concerns through diplomatic channels, seeking clarity from host governments on what they're doing and why they're doing it, and encouraging a swift response. And we're more powerful when we do that collectively through vehicles like MFC and FOC. But we need to be realistic, right? Given what I've just said about the politics of all of that. So we need longer term strategies as well, which comes back to understanding those underlying drivers that lead to shutdowns in the first place. That means long, important work in helping domestic actors to develop legal frameworks, independent oversight measures, planning for a future when there may be a moment to create a legislative framework for these kinds of things. And just to say, in the MFC, we have this high-level panel of legal experts, of which Catherine is an esteemed member. That's a vehicle that we can use to provide technical or legal advice to states seeking to reform or modernize their laws. And lastly, on the technology front, I think governments must look ahead and consider how they can future-proof democratic systems against new forms of disruption. And that's where all these emerging technologies, which I don't fully understand, but I know LNI does, come into play, because we need to find all the ways that we can to obviate the most restrictive practices of government in order to support innovation, promote open and secure digital infrastructure, and alongside that, do all the work that we're doing multilaterally to uphold shared standards, etc., etc. So it's not one thing, it's multiple things. It's the short run against the long run. It's governments who we can work with against governments who we can't work with, and that all, I guess, necessitates different kind of approaches to get the outcomes that we want to see.
I'll come to Nompilo. Let me ask a quick one. Based on what Stefan has mentioned, the long term as well as the short term and the middle term and the never happening scenario, because some of it is pretty extremely long term. And if you're working, like you mentioned, governments that are not willing to listen, but what are some of these actions that for you have made sense? What are the ones that actually make a difference on the ground, that they don't come too late or fall too short of what you're hoping? I'm thinking in terms here, like I mentioned earlier, there's the whole, Catherine also mentioned, where the court say the matter is now moot because the internet has been restored. What about in scenarios where Stefan and his friends come in and say it's wrong for you to shut down the internet? Is that kind of action coming too late, too or falling far short of what you'd hope would happen to have an impact when internet shutdowns are happening? Nompilo.
Thank you very much,
reaction, because
Catherine.
I know there are various ways of looking at how this plays out.
Yes, yes. I mean, you're raising quite a very important conversation, and I would like to agree with Stefan in terms of how you put it, actually. And this is what actually sits at the core of our advocacy work. You know, you think about public engagement versus private engagement. You think about immediate plans. You think about a long-term advocacy strategy. There are a lot of moving points involved. And in the face of an imminent shutdown, there are multiple strategies which have worked. I would highlight that one, obviously, the solidarity from the broader community is actually very important. So this includes not only the quiet diplomacy from the MFC member states and others, but also even voices of civil society actors, international press freedom organizations who openly speak against the internet restrictions, against the impact, speak on the impact that these restrictions have. And I want to agree also with Stefan in terms of speaking the language of governments. We have tried to engage particularly on the issue of national security, because that is one of the reasons that is always relied on. And we argue it's broad, it's vague. You know, we have tried to engage on that conversation. But with regard to internet shutdowns, I've actually realized that sometimes it's good even to branch off and focus on civil and economic, on social and economic rights. We are focused on political and civil rights, but it's good to focus on socio-economic rights. So sometimes throw in the numbers. I'll go back to Zimbabwe again. The government of Zimbabwe, its mantra has been Zimbabwe is open for business. If they are shutting down the internet, how does that affect their foreign policy with regard to being open for business, with regard to trade? So sometimes that's also the strategy that we need to take. Think about the areas that the government is prioritizing and position the shutdown in terms of how it affects the government strategy, because that is how you get governments to listen. But of course, also identifying more sympathetic actors within the space. Right now, as part of our work at IP, mainly focused on climate environmental journalism, but something that we've started is that we are mapping out acknowledgements from state actors who speak about the importance of climate environmental journalism. The reason why we are doing that is to have a pattern and be able to map out the sympathetic actors within the various governments, the state actors who are more inclined to support the conversation on strengthening support for climate environmental journalists. We can take the same approach also for internet shutdowns, identify actors within governments, within parliamentary portfolio committees, within the ministries who are more sympathetic to the conversation on openness and accessibility of the internet. You'd find that there are more, some also are more progressive, but also to say strategic litigation works. We saw that in several other countries. At the time when the internet is happening, approach the courts very quickly, institute strategic litigation. You'd find that the government, more in some cases, they'll definitely back out and restore the internet, which is why at the time when the case is fully heard, it's now a moot conversation, because you'd have quickly instituted litigation. By the time the judge speaks, and sits to hear the case, the case cannot be heard on the merits anymore. So for me, I would say it's a case of utilizing various strategies, all of them at one time. Some will be a hit and miss. Some will definitely give us the impact that we want. So we cannot take a narrow approach. We have to utilize all the avenues at our disposal.
It went down. Thank you very much. I want to turn to Catherine and maybe ask you a similar. Okay, we've got government diplomacy coming into play and making their defense or asking questions. When it comes to the law, the one thing I know, especially in Kenya, and I know it's the same in Uganda, is this very broad definition of reasons what the security or the reasons why the internet is closed or why the government wants to shut down the internet. It's very broad. And my question is, are there ways that we can are there opportunities, or is there an opportunity for us to look at our legal system and see how we can make it possible for internet service providers or these companies? So whereas the law says that the government has the right to do X, Y, Z, looking at the licensing so that they will be beholden to letting us know why they are shutting down the internet, not using this very broad descriptor of how do I say, of reasons why we should shut down the internet. Are there ways of us maybe looking at the legal, from the legal angle, so that we can actually define what the government should use the shutdown for and what it shouldn't, as well as making it possible for the alternative interventions that Elonai has mentioned, which doesn't mean we kill everybody, but we just selectively switch off for certain situations, in certain situations, but not for everyone, so that these impacts are not felt across the board.
Yeah, sure. So we have the legal standards. So Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is very clear that, you know, any restrictions on freedom of expression should be found in the law. They must be necessary, they must serve a legitimate purpose, and be proportionate to the potential harm faced. So we've seen our regional courts, like the ECOWAS court, during the internet shutdown in Togo, 2019, when there were protests, a group of people, Amnesty International and some journalists, went to court to challenge that shutdown, and the court was clear, and it said access to internet should be seen as a right that requires protection of the law, and interference with this has to be provided for by the law, specifying the grounds of such internet shutdown. And we've gone ahead to see the ECOWAS court again during when the government of Nigeria ordered for a disruption or a shutdown of Twitter. The court emphasized again it must be stipulated in the law. And for transparency's sake, you know, it requires that, you know, the provisions for internet shutdowns within the law lay down, you know, possibility to discuss issues of proportionality. So firstly, it's very critical that the legislation exists to stipulate the circumstances under which an internet shutdown is permitted. So courts, as we've said, have repeatedly found that a lack of such law or legal framework means that any internet shutdown that happens outside the law automatically violates the right to freedom of expression. And it's essential, again, under international human rights law, but it's also necessary to assess compliance with the requirements of necessity, proportionality, and legitimacy. When we look at the additional safeguards that you're talking about, we've seen that CSOs should definitely prioritize, you know, pursuing these cases at regional or international level. But for Africa, we know that most of the African countries cannot access the regional courts, the African courts, to bring internet shutdown cases. As you know, out of the 54 countries, we only had 12 countries in Africa that deposited an instrument that allows NGOs and citizens to bring cases before the courts. And now we've seen an exodus of some of those countries that had deposited that instrument. So from 12, we now have only 8 countries that allow citizens to challenge internet shutdowns and other media freedom issues in the African court. So we have a diminished platform, you know, to bring these cases in the regional, in the utmost regional courts in the continent. So that leaves us with our domestic courts, which are sometimes fearful to legislate on these issues. So I think overall we need to have that conversation on how the law on internet shutdowns should look like.
Yeah, because one of the things I was thinking about, I would want, okay, they shut me down, they shut down the internet. Tell me why you did it. I mean, the internet, the ISPs, all these companies should be willing to be transparent to tell us that they've shut us down because we were told to shut you down because of X, if they can share that with us. But maybe that's a conversation for another day, which might take us another afternoon. But I just wanted to ask to wrap up, a quick wrap up, because we wanted to take questions from the audience. But before we do that, I can see Derek has a question. And so he's got his hand up, and we have Elonai also a hand up. So I'll go to you, Derek, and then I'll come to Elonai before we do the final wrap.
Thank you, Catherine. And actually mine was more of a point on the questions from the audience. I was just going to suggest at this stage, it's been such a fascinating discussion that for those of you in the audience who would like to ask a question, perhaps the easiest way right now would be to put it in the chat, because we do have a few questions in there. Catherine, I'm happy to report on a few of those. There's been one about direct to sell, and it might be interesting to get perhaps Elonai to explain what that is for people in the audience who don't know. And then a really good point from our friend and colleague Maya at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that there is currently a major shutdown in Moscow, with several Reuters journalists reporting there's no mobile internet connection. So a very timely discussion. But maybe people could post questions in the chat and we could look at those. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Derek. We'll ask Elonai to respond to the question that you've mentioned. I've just seen it. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat. And then the issue that she wanted to raise before that when she put up her hand. Elonai?
So one thing I wanted to add, when we're talking about the legal ecosystem, I just wanted to highlight that a lot of civil society organizations use the Right to Information Act in their jurisdictions to get that transparency from the government about what the shutdown orders are. An example that comes to mind is just the Software Freedom Law Center in India does a lot of work tracking network shutdowns using the Right to Information Act and trying to actually get a hold of the orders, the governmental orders. And so if you're looking for an example of how the RTI has been used and how it has been used to track network shutdowns, I would suggest looking at the work that the Software Freedom Law Center in India has done. And I am not an expert on direct-to-cell satellite, the technology, but I would say that it is being explored for sure as a technology to help maintain access during network shutdowns. We are having conversations within the Freedom Online Coalition about its usefulness, and I would also welcome members from the audience who perhaps are more deeply connected to the solution to share more about it.
Thank you so much. I want to do a quick round robin, everybody within the panel before we wrap up, so that we can have Jorge with his closing remarks, and we can address some of the questions or any more questions or a very short comment if you have the time from the audience. A quick one now from all of you. I will go with you, Elonai, since you're still on. And the question I want from you, the answer I want from you is maybe a quick practical action that people in the audience can take to push back against internet shutdown. What would that be if you're to, less than a minute? What would that one action? And I know there are many. Just think of one key thing. And then the other members of the panel, please don't repeat what somebody else said. We want to walk out of here with 5 different things that we can do within the next 12 months, maybe, if we are good. Or if you can.
Yeah, maybe from G&I's perspective, I'll just come back to what we ask companies to do, that we ask them to be doing human rights impact assessments and human rights due diligence before they even enter a market, to understand what the regulatory environment is. We ask them to have policies and processes, escalation processes in place for when they get requests for internet shutdowns. We ask them to only comply with legal requests, to comply in the most narrow way possible, to do an evaluation of necessity, proportionality, and legality.
Thank you. Nompilo? Practical, something I can do today or tomorrow, starting tomorrow. Because we have an audience who are mainly maybe not only policymakers, but they're also practicing journalists or newsroom managers. So something practical, something we can do. Thank you.
I think I would go back to the issue of just a mindset shift. My key recommendation being that we, as the media community, as press freedom organizations, we need to identify internet shutdowns as a press freedom issue. I've seen that most of the time coordinated advocacy around internet shutdowns has been done mainly by the digital rights community. But with the level of impact that these shutdowns also have on the media itself, I think it is important also that as press freedom organizations defending media freedom globally, regionally, nationally, we also prioritize internet shutdowns as a press freedom issue. And even when we talk about impunity for attacks against journalists, we also talk about internet shutdowns. Earlier, I mentioned in a separate conversation that we had with the panel around the situation of journalists in Sudan that have not had internet access for 3 years. Quite recently, I spoke to one of IPI's 2025 World Press Freedom Heroes, Tesfalem, who reported in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, during the war and an internet shutdown. And he was talking about how difficult it was, but also how obviously that was not a conversation that was a priority. The internet shutdown itself was not a priority. And the people that were able to report were journalists from bigger newsrooms who had access, who could broadcast through satellite television. So when we recognize the impact of internet shutdowns in context of war, in context of conflict, and especially on local journalists, I think as a community we recognize why it is very urgent to start prioritizing this issue and treating it as a press freedom issue that needs our full attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nompilo. Catherine, your one takeaway, short and sweet, so that we can finish with Stefan and a final wrap from me, and then we hand over to Derek. Yep.
Yeah, sure. I think it's important for the international media community to just ensure that there's support that can be provided from the outside of the countries that are facing internet shutdown. So, for example, establishing methods of receiving news that can be reported during internet blackouts and publishing this from the unaffected locations, and also CSOs, the funders, and the diplomats should consider programs that can assist smaller media outlets and independent journalists with workaround resources to access the internet, like VPN, satellite, and SIM cards. And like Stephanie said, the high-level panel is here. We are a great resource to support states around the world to ensure that their legislation is in conformity with international standards.
Thank you very much. Stefan, a quick short one thing, practical thing we can take away from what we might try and implement or we'll try and implement.
Thanks, Catherine. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Good, because I think I'm having my own version of an internet shutdown here due to tech challenges, I think, rather than nefarious government action. So look, practical action. Someone said it earlier, we need to build the resilience of the media itself to the shutdowns, and media can be very innovative, even in the worst situations. But we also need to build wider societal resilience. With the best will in the world, shutdowns will happen, despite all of our strategies and all the rest of it. So what can we do to ensure that society is as resilient as it can be to withstand the pressure, and also that the costs on government of doing shutdowns are as high as they can be? And that's something about making sure, the technological workarounds are important, but also equipping democracy activists and civil society to be able to sustain themselves when shutdowns happen. And if you do more of that, then even in the most difficult context, governments will think twice about shutting down the internet.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so glad we've had this conversation. I know we could continue talking and we needed time to get questions from the audience, but we seem to be running short of time. We only have 5 minutes. If there's one thing I can take away from this is that we shouldn't be looking at internet shutdowns as a single, just a press freedom issue. It has so many other impacts on so many other different levels, and we should be pulling together to try and prevent them than trying to just look at it from one perspective. I want to thank you guys, all of you. Thank you so much for making my job so easy. I want to hand over to you, Derek. I know we are short of time, and I wanted to hear from Mr. Jorge, who is our guest. Thank you so much, everyone. And please continue sharing your questions on the chat, because I think we will be able to respond to them as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your excellent moderation, and to the panel for making that such an engaging discussion, really fascinating. So quickly, before we finish, I would like to hand over to Jorge Cancio, the co-director of international relations at the Federal Office of Communications of Switzerland. And of course, Switzerland is the chair of the Freedom Online Coalition. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Just to be sure, do I take like 3 or 4 minutes, or how do we are in terms of timing?
Yeah, I think if people are happy just to stay slightly over, then yeah, 3 or 4 minutes would be great. Thank you.
Okay, let's try. So thank you. This has been a brilliant, a very rich discussion. As Ambassador Perhmann noted, it is central that we have been able to have this conversation despite the de facto cancellation or shutdown of RightsCon. I want to thank the Media Freedom Coalition for co-hosting this session with us. And I think it shows that we have a lot in common, a lot to work on. Internet shutdowns are at their core an attack on media freedom and digital rights, on rights as such, and addressing them demands exactly this kind of joint effort. So my thanks go also to the moderator and the panelists for their expertise and candor, and for the active participation of everyone. The data is clear. Internet shutdowns are becoming a governance tool of first resort, deployed routinely during elections, protests, moments of political stress, and even exams, as Catherine Gicheru rightly underlined. And as Elona Hickok mentioned, the research shows that there are many different scenarios and kinds and degrees of internet shutdowns. Regarding the justifications, such as public order or national security, they are rarely matched by evidence, proportionality, or accountability. We heard clearly about the human cost. Journalists cut off from sources and audiences, as Sylvie Coudray highlighted, local and independent media already operating on thin margins are disproportionately harmed. Citizens are deprived of the information they need precisely when they need it most, and a long range of wider impacts on society and economy, as Stefan Kostov so eloquently showed. And we heard the perverse irony: shutdowns do not reduce misinformation, they create, as Nampila Simanje pointed out, the vacuum in which it thrives. Addressing internet shutdowns is a central priority for the FOC, and we have it in our program of action. In this year, we had a joint statement on what happened in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Yesterday, we had an in-depth capacity building session during our strategy and coordination meeting. And finally, also the former Freedom Online Coalition Task Force on Internet Shutdowns worked a lot and built a body of evidence on this matter. I want also to briefly reflect on how the coalitions hosting this session can carry forward the policy ideas that emerged. On policy safeguards, we heard calls for clear proportionality standards and independent judicial oversight, and a great need for understanding the enabling role of access for enjoying human rights, as Catherine Anite stressed. Our coalitions can support the development and promotion of these norms through our engagement in multilateral fora and by encouraging members to also apply these standards domestically. On infrastructure resilience, we heard that the technical part matters a lot. Diverse routing, community networks, and distributed infrastructure and centralized or decentralized markets are not just engineering questions, they are human rights questions, as Elena explained. And transparency and accountability, where restrictions are imposed, there must be really transparency frameworks, and our coalitions can help in supporting this. Finally, international standards. It's clear that human rights law provides a solid foundation. The challenge is implementation and political will, or misguided or uninformed political will, which have to be addressed. So before I close, I want to name something that ran through every intervention today. This is not a problem that any one actor can solve, meaning multi-stakeholder is a must. Governments and policymakers must set the legal and policy frameworks and understand the consequences of using the off switch. Journalists and media organizations must continue to document, advocate, and uphold their role as watchdog of power. Industry must refuse to be complicit and must build for openness. Civil society has a role in holding everyone accountable, strategize on how to best resist shutdowns, and build coalitions. International bodies and coalitions must create the norms, the pressure, and the safe spaces for all of this to happen. And the multi-stakeholder model is not always easy, but today's session demonstrates why it is indispensable. The FOC, at least talking on behalf of the FOC, will continue to make this work a priority. We will carry the insights from today's session into our ongoing work within our membership and with our advisory network, where all these norms are also being discussed and also shaped. Thank you again to the Media Freedom Coalition, to our speakers, and to everyone in this room. The conversation does not end here. Back to you, Derek. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Jorge. And I think you've closed off, wound up the panel and the event very, very well there. There's little to add. Just to say thank you again from our side to all the panelists, the speakers, and to everyone who's joined today. Again, thank you for your flexibility and being able to come to this session online. And we do hope to see you again at a meeting, a session, hopefully in person, not too long from now, but also online. So thanks again very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.